Chapter 6 is where you learn how to deal with rational expressions and equations. And rational is just a fancy math word for fractions. And because the word rational has what? It has a root word of ratio. Alright, so we tend to, in math, refer to them as rational rather than fractions, but it basically is the same thing. So just like in arithmetic, you learn how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide fractions. You also learn how to simplify them. We're gonna deal with all that in here, and then use them to also solve equations and solve some word problems. So our first section, first section is concerned with simplifying rational expressions. And so as we get into that, let me first introduce it with an ordinary fraction and review how we simplify them. So let's look at this fraction, 30 over 42. All right, now you learn in arithmetic that you reduce a fraction like this by dividing the top and bottom by the same number. So we could divide them both by 2, for example. This would give us 15 over 21. And then you might say, well, look, I can also divide them by 3. So I'll divide each of these by 3 and I get 5 over 7. All right, so it's a perfectly great technique for simplifying small fractions like this. But with algebra, it's just close to impossible to do that with many of these problems. So we need something a little broader technique to deal with. And so, but here's pretty much what we're going to do. Now we could go from this step to this step by dividing by 6, couldn't we? In other words, it's 30 divided by 6 over 42 divided by 6, and that will give us 5/7. But here's how I want to prefer to look at it, us to look at it. We can divide a 6 out of each of these. That means 6 is a common factor of both these numbers. So if I factored 30 as 6 times 5 and 42 as 6 times 7, then we can divide the common factors, the 6's, divide off. And so that gives us the 5/7. So it's a very similar process to this, but a little subtle in this way. We're going to use factoring in order to reduce our algebraic fractions or rational expressions. So let me illustrate that with a kind of a simple one here. Here's our algebraic problem. Simplify 4x squared minus 6x, all divided by 10x minus 15. All right, now I'm going to get into this in another video more so, but there's a real easy mistake to make. It's easy to think, well, let's simplify 4/10, and let's simplify 6/15. Okay, it doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. So I'll illustrate that later why that's a very undependable method of reducing fractions. One of the problems is that we have 2 terms up here and 2 terms down there. By which I mean they're added or subtracted together, and that kind of throws a monkey wrench into things. So the one reliable thing we can do is to factor each of them. And if you look at the numerator, we can factor 4x squared minus 6x. We can factor out 2x as our greatest common factor, and that gives us 2x minus 3. And down below we can factor out what? We can factor out a 5. And by the way, if you're rusty at factoring and you have not watched my videos on factoring, then you probably should go back and do that, because your ability to correctly factor things is extremely important throughout this whole chapter. So you got to get that factoring down. If you haven't refreshed yourself on factoring, then you need to go back and do that before you do this chapter. Otherwise, you're just going to keep getting them wrong. All right. So we factored out the greatest common factor from each, and look what we have here. We have 2x minus 3 in both places. And so we're allowed, it works, we can cancel these off. Literally, we're dividing this part of the denominator into that part of the numerator, and we're getting 1 over 1. And of course 1 over 1 is 1, so we can kind of ignore those 1's, and we're left with 2x over 5. So that's, and that's it. We can't reduce 2x over 5. 2/5 won't reduce, and x is going to stay where it's at. So now the problem is fully simplified.